I watched through my security camera as my mother was handcuffed and dragged away from my penthouse door, her screams echoing through the hallway. My father tried to resist shoving the police officer, which only made things worse. My 29-year-old sister Bethany stood frozen, her phone dangling from her hand, the influencer facade completely shattered. This was the moment everything I had worked for, everything I had built in silence, finally collided with the family that had spent 3 decades making me feel invisible. And I felt absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. If this story resonates with you, or if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more stories like this, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your support means everything. Let me take you back to where this all started, because the destruction you just witnessed did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of 33 years of being the forgotten daughter, the one who was expected to achieve, without acknowledgement, to give without receiving, to exist without complaint. My name is Christina, and I am a regional director for a pharmaceutical company. At 33 years old, I have climbed every rung of the corporate ladder through sheer determination, countless sleepless nights, and a work ethic that bordered on obsession. But none of that mattered to my family. To them, I was simply the responsible one, the boring one, the one who did not need attention because I could take care of myself. My younger sister Bethany, on the other hand, was their shining star, despite having accomplished virtually nothing in her 29 years, except accumulating Instagram followers and an impressive collection of designer handbags purchased with our parents' money. The inequality started early. I remember being 12 years old, receiving a simple card for my birthday, while Bethany, at 8, got a party with a bounce house and a magician. When I asked why, my mother simply said I was more mature and did not need all that fuss. That was the first time I learnt that being capable meant being overlooked. It was a lesson that would repeat itself in countless variations throughout my life. I put myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs. Bethany had her tuition fully paid by our parents. I bought my first car with money I had saved for 2 years. Bethany got a brand new SUV as a surprise gift. I moved into a cramped studio apartment after graduation and furnished it with second-hand finds. Bethany lived at home rent-free in a bedroom that had been renovated 3 times to match her evolving aesthetic preferences. The disparity was not just financial, it was emotional, psychological, existential. Every achievement I earned was met with a brief nod and a quick change of subject. Every mundane update from Bethany's life was celebrated like a major victory. When I got my first promotion, my mother's response was to ask if that meant I would finally have time to visit more often. When Bethany posted a photo that got 10,000 likes, my parents threw her a celebration dinner and invited extended family to commemorate her rising influence. I stopped sharing my successes with them around the time I turned 27. It was easier to keep my accomplishments to myself than to feel the sting of their indifference. I attended family gatherings, out of obligation sat quietly through dinners, where Bethany dominated every conversation, with tales of brand collaborations that never materialized, and influencer events that consisted of standing in line at product launches. My parents hung on her every word, their faces glowing with pride that I had never seen directed at me. My grandparents played a significant role in this toxic dynamic. They were wealthy, influential people who had built a successful real estate empire. They had always favoured Bethany, seeing her as the one with personality and charm, while viewing me as too serious and career-focused. Their money flowed freely to my parents, who in turn channeled it primarily toward Bethany's lifestyle. The unspoken expectation was that Bethany would eventually marry well and represent the family's social standing, while I had already proven I did not need their help. Being self-sufficient had become my punishment rather than my achievement. 3 years ago, I set a goal that would change everything. I decided I was going to buy a penthouse in Chicago, something spectacular, something that would be entirely mine. I worked like a woman possessed. I took on additional projects, networked relentlessly, negotiated raises with the precision of a surgeon. I saved every penny I could, invested wisely, and built my wealth in complete silence. No one in my family knew what I was doing. I had learned that lesson well. Share nothing, expect nothing, and you will never be disappointed. Last year I finally did it. I purchased a stunning 3-bedroom penthouse on the 42nd floor of a luxury building in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city skyline. The kitchen was outfitted with top-of-the-line appliances. The master suite had a spa-like bathroom with a soaking tub overlooking the glittering lights below. I had a home office with custom built-ins, a guest room I converted into a state-of-the-art gym, and a living space that looked like something out of an architecture magazine. It was my sanctuary, my fortress, my tangible proof that I had succeeded in spite of being invisible. I installed advanced security systems, biometric locks, and cameras monitoring every entry point. The building itself was exclusive with a professional security team and strict access protocols. I felt safe there in a way I had never felt safe anywhere else. This was my space governed by my rules, protected from intrusion. I did not tell my family about the penthouse. This was intentional and non-negotiable. I knew with absolute certainty that if they learned about it, they would find a way to colonize it, to make demands on it, to treat my achievement as a family resource rather than a personal victory. So I maintained my silence. When they asked about my living situation, I was vague. I let them assume I was still in some modest apartment befitting their image of me as the serious, unexciting daughter. For 8 blissful months I lived in my penthouse in peace. I would come home after long days at work, pour myself a glass of wine, and stand at those massive windows watching the city lights twinkle below. I felt powerful, I felt accomplished, I felt free. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration, every high-end appliance was a testament to what I had achieved on my own. No one could take this from me, because no one even knew it existed. Then came the phone call that shattered my carefully constructed privacy. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. I usually let these calls go to voicemail, responding later with a brief text, but something made me step out and answer. Her voice was saccharine sweet, which immediately put me on alert. She wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, she said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. She proposed a restaurant I knew was expensive and trendy, the kind of place she liked to be seen. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I should have known better. I should have recognised the trap being laid. The lunch was scheduled for that Friday. I arrived exactly on time to find not just my mother but my father and Bethany as well. They were already seated at a prominent table, my mother dressed in an outfit I recognised as new and expensive, Bethany, scrolling through her phone, with the detached air of someone who would rather be anywhere else. The ambush was immediate and obvious. After we ordered, my mother leaned forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We know about your penthouse," she said. The words hung in the air like an accusation. My blood ran cold. "Barbara Hendricks told us all about it. She was so impressed with your new place when she visited the building to see her daughter. She said you have quite the setup there." Barbara Hendricks, an old friend of my mother's, someone I barely remembered, whose daughter apparently lived in my building. Of course. Of course, this was how my secret would be exposed, not through my choice to share, but through random chance and someone else's loose lips. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was screaming. "How dare you keep this from us?" my mother continued, her voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "We are your family. Why would you hide something like this? Are you ashamed of us?" The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly inverted from reality, that I almost laughed. Ashamed, I was not ashamed of them. I had simply learned that sharing anything important with them meant watching it be diminished, dismissed, or appropriated. But I could not say that here, not in this public space, where my mother had deliberately chosen to confront me. "I am 33 years old," I said quietly. "I do not need to report every decision I make to you. This is my home, purchased with money I earned. I did not see the need to announce it." My father, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "This is unacceptable, Christina. We had to hear about this from a stranger. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for us? What kind of daughter treats her parents this way?" The hypocrisy was breathtaking. What kind of daughter? What kind of parents had they been? But again I held my tongue. This was not the place for that conversation. Then came the real reason for this lunch ambush. My mother's face shifted from hurt to hopeful, a transition I recognised as the prelude to a demand. You know, Bethany has been trying so hard to build her brand. She really needs a dedicated space for content creation. Your penthouse has that spare bedroom, does it not? It would be perfect for her. She could move in and really focus on growing her influence. I stared at her, genuinely unable to process what I was hearing. She wanted Bethany to move into my home, into my sanctuary, into the space I had worked myself nearly to exhaustion to afford. She said it as if it were the most reasonable request in the world, as if my home were a family asset to be distributed according to their needs rather than my property. That is my home office, I said, keeping my voice level through sheer force of will, and Bethany will not be moving into my apartment. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face flushed red. My father's jaw clenched. Even Bethany looked up from her phone, sensing the tension. "You are being selfish," my mother hissed, leaning forward. "You have all that space and you cannot help your own sister. We raised you better than this. Family helps family. Family helps family." The words that had been used to extract countless favours, money, time and emotional labour from me over the years. Family helps family, but apparently only when the help flowed in one direction. I had never seen any of them help me. Not when I was working 3 jobs to get through college. Not when I was living on ramen noodles to save for a security deposit. Not when I was pulling all-nighters to secure the promotion that led to the next promotion that eventually led to the penthouse they now wanted access to. "Bethany is 29 years old," I said, my voice cold and clear. "It is time for her to stand on her own 2 feet. I am not going to enable her dependence by giving her free housing in a luxury penthouse. If she wants to build a career, she can do what I did, work for it." Bethany's face flushed with embarrassment or anger, I could not tell which. She mumbled something under her breath that sounded like, "I knew you would be like this." My father stood up slightly, his face dark with rage. "You ungrateful, selfish girl, after everything we have done for you." Everything they had done for me. The phrase was so absurd I actually did laugh, a short, bitter sound that made my mother flinch. I stood up, placed $200 on the table to cover the meal none of us had touched, and looked at all 3 of them. "I have nothing more to say. Do not contact me unless you are ready to have an actual conversation that does not involve making demands on my property or my life." I walked out of that restaurant without looking back, even as my mother called after me, her voice shrill with indignation. I could feel other diners staring, could sense the whispers starting. I did not care. Something had broken in me during that lunch, some final thread of obligation that had kept me tethered to their dysfunction. I was done. The next few days were an onslaught of messages and calls. My mother left voicemails ranging from hurt and weepy to angry and accusatory. My father sent texts about family values and respect. Bethany posted cryptic messages on Instagram about family betrayal and fake people clearly fishing for sympathy from her followers. I ignored all of it. I went to work, came home to my penthouse, and reinforced my decision with every passing hour. I had been right to keep this place secret. I had been right to set boundaries. I would not let them guilt me into backtracking. But I underestimated their sense of entitlement and their willingness to escalate. A week after the disastrous lunch, I received a call from Howard, the head of security at my building. He informed me that 3 people claiming to be my family had shown up at the front desk, insisting they needed access to my apartment. Howard had politely but firmly refused them entry, explaining that he could not allow anyone up without my explicit permission. They had left angry, making vague threats about their rights and my obligations. I thanked Howard and immediately called my attorney. I had hired her a few years back to help with some contract negotiations, and she had become a trusted advisor. I explained the situation, including the lunch confrontation and the attempted building entry. She listened carefully, then advised me, in no uncertain terms, to take legal action immediately. This was not going to stop, she told me. They would continue to push boundaries until I established legal consequences for their behaviour. That afternoon, I went to the police station and filed for an order of protection. I documented everything: the history of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation, the lunch ambush, the attempted entry to my building, the harassing messages and calls. The officer who took my report was professional and sympathetic. He warned me that filing against family members could have serious repercussions, that they would likely face criminal charges if they violated the order. I told him I understood and that I was prepared for those consequences. He processed the paperwork and told me the order would be served within 48 hours. I went home that night feeling a strange mixture of emotions. There was relief at having taken concrete action to protect myself. There was also grief, a deep sadness at what my family relationships had become. But underneath it all was a solid core of determination. I had spent my entire life being treated as less important, less valuable, less deserving than Bethany. I had been expected to achieve without support, to give without receiving, to remain silent about my hurt and disappointment. I was done with all of it. If this was what it took to protect my peace and my property, then this was what I would do. The order of protection was served on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was exploding with messages from extended family members. Aunts and uncles I barely spoke to were suddenly texting and calling, demanding to know how I could do this to my parents, how I could be so cruel, how I could destroy the family over something so petty as a living arrangement dispute. The narrative my parents had spun was predictable. I was the villain, the selfish daughter who had turned her back on family, who valued material possessions over relationships, who had weaponized the legal system against her own blood. I did not engage with most of these messages, but I did send a group text to the family members who had contacted me, attaching several videos from my security cameras, showing my parents' and Bethany's behaviour at my building, along with screenshots of the threatening and manipulative messages they had sent me. I wrote a brief explanation outlining the decades of differential treatment, the demands they had made on my property, and my right to set boundaries and protect my home. I ended with a simple statement: I am not discussing this further. If you have questions about what happened, direct them to the people who created this situation through their actions. The responses were mixed. Some family members doubled down on their criticism, insisting that I was overreacting and that family disputes should be handled privately. But others, to my surprise, reached out with support. A cousin I had not spoken to in years called to tell me she had always noticed how differently I was treated and that she admired my courage in standing up for myself. An aunt sent a text saying she wished she had set boundaries with her own family years ago. These unexpected allies reminded me that I was not crazy, that my perceptions of the inequality and disrespect were valid. But my parents were not done. They believed apparently that the order of protection was just another obstacle to overcome, another boundary they could push through with enough determination. They could not fathom that there would be real consequences for violating it. This failure of imagination would prove to be their downfall. It was a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the order had been served. I was at work in a conference room presenting a quarterly analysis to my executive team when my phone buzzed with an alert from my security system. I glanced down to see multiple camera feeds activating at once. My heart rate spiked. Someone was at my door. I excused myself from the meeting, citing an urgent personal matter, and retreated to my office. I pulled up the security feed on my laptop and felt my blood run cold. There they were. My mother, my father, Bethany, and a fourth man I did not immediately recognise, but who carried a toolkit that identified him as a locksmith. They were standing outside my penthouse door, and my mother was attempting to insert a key into the lock. I watched in real time as she jiggled the key, growing increasingly frustrated when the lock did not respond. Of course it did not respond. I had biometric locks that required either my fingerprint, my facial recognition, or a specialised code that changed weekly. Whatever key she had, whether she had somehow copied an old key from years ago when I lived elsewhere, or had simply brought a random key hoping it would work, it was useless. My father stepped forward and tried using what appeared to be a credit card to jimmy the lock, a tactic he had apparently learned from movies. When that also failed, he actually put his shoulder against the door and tried to force it. The door did not budge. It was reinforced steel in a luxury frame designed to resist exactly this kind of attempted breach. The locksmith, who I later learned was named Dennis, and was apparently a friend of my father's, examined the lock and shook his head. I could not hear the conversation, but his body language was clear. This was not a lock he could or would bypass. He appeared to be explaining something to my parents, gesturing at the high-tech security features and backing away from the door. My father argued with him, his face growing red with anger, but Dennis held firm and eventually left the scene entirely, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. That was when Howard arrived. I watched as he approached my family with professional courtesy, though I could see the tension in his posture. He spoke to them calmly, and while I could not hear his exact words through the camera, I knew he was informing them that they needed to leave immediately, that they were violating both building policy and a legal order of protection. My mother whirled on him, her face contorted with rage. I could see her shouting, pointing at the door, pointing at Howard, gesticulating wildly. The words I could read on her lips were variations of, "We are her family, and she cannot do this to us." My father joined in, stepping close to Howard, in what was clearly an attempt at physical intimidation. Howard did not back down. He pulled out his phone, and I knew, without needing audio, that he was calling the police. That was when my mother completely lost control. She began pounding on my door with her fists, screaming at the top of her lungs. I could hear her even through the reinforced steel, her voice shrill and desperate. "Christina, you ungrateful bitch! Open this door right now. You owe us. After everything we sacrificed for you, you cannot treat your family like this." The irony of her words would have been funny if the situation were not so disturbing. What had they sacrificed for me? I had received nothing from them but neglect and dismissal. But in their minds they had given me life, raised me to adulthood, and that was enough to entitle them to anything I achieved thereafter. It was a twisted logic that had governed our relationship for decades, and I was finally refusing to accept it. Bethany stood off to the side, her phone still in her hand, but she was no longer filming or scrolling. She looked horrified, genuinely shocked by what was unfolding. This was the first time I suspected that she was seeing the full extent of our parents' dysfunction. She had always been shielded from consequences, always protected from reality. Now reality was crashing down around all of them. The police arrived within 6 minutes. 2 officers, 1 male and 1 female, approached the scene with professional caution. Howard met them first, provided context, and then stepped aside. The female officer approached my mother, who was still screaming and pounding on the door, and spoke to her firmly. When my mother did not immediately comply, continuing her assault on my door and her verbal assault on me through it, the officer placed a hand on her arm and repeated the instruction to step away from the door. My mother spun around and shoved the officer. It was not a hard shove, but it was a shove nonetheless, an act of resistance against a law enforcement officer in the execution of her duties. That was the moment everything changed. The male officer immediately stepped in, taking hold of my mother's arms. She struggled, screaming about her rights, about being a victim, about her terrible daughter who had turned on her own family. The female officer began reading my mother her rights, while her partner secured her wrists in handcuffs. My mother went completely hysterical, wailing and thrashing, making the situation infinitely worse for herself. My father lunged forward, trying to physically intervene, shouting at the officers to let his wife go. The male officer released my mother into his partner's custody and turned to address my father, warning him to stand back. When my father continued to advance, the officer had no choice but to restrain him as well. I watched my father being handcuffed, still shouting, still trying to assert his authority in a situation where he had none. The female officer called for backup, and within minutes 2 more patrol cars arrived. My parents were escorted to separate vehicles, still protesting, still claiming victimhood. Through it all, Bethany stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her carefully curated influencer persona completely shattered. She did not try to film this for content. She did not try to spin this into a narrative. She simply stood there, confronted with the ugly reality that had always been lurking beneath our family's surface. One of the officers spoke with Howard, collecting his statement and the building's security footage. Another officer knocked on my door, but I did not answer. I was still at my office, watching everything unfold remotely. I called the building and asked them to inform the police that I was the homeowner, that I had filed the order of protection, and that I would provide a full statement later in the day at the station. The officer on site seemed satisfied with this arrangement and departed with his colleagues, leaving Bethany alone in the hallway. She stood there for a long moment, staring at my door. Then she pulled out her phone, but instead of posting something online, she called me. My phone rang, showing her name on the screen. I almost did not answer, but something in me wanted to hear what she would say. I picked up, but did not speak first. Her voice was small, shaky, completely stripped of its usual casual confidence. "Christina," she whispered. "I am so sorry. I did not want this. I did not know it would go this far." "But you were here," I said quietly. "You came with them to break into my home." There was a long silence. I did not know they were actually going to try to force their way in. I thought they just wanted to talk to you. I was silent, letting her sit with that weak excuse. When I speak again, her voice broke. "I have been so stupid. Mom and Dad have always made everything so easy for me, and I never questioned it. I never thought about what it meant that everything came to me while you got nothing. I am sorry, Christina. I really am." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words. An apology was something, but it could not undo 30 years of inequality and neglect. "I hope you mean that," I said finally. "Because what just happened is not my fault, Bethany. It is the consequence of their choices, of their refusal to respect my boundaries or treat me like an autonomous adult." "I know," she said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. "I do not want to move into your apartment, Christina. I do not want any of this. I just want things to be normal again. But I am starting to realize they were never really normal, were they?" "No," I said softly. "They were not." We said goodbye shortly after that. I did not know what our relationship would look like going forward, if we would even have one. But that conversation marked the first time Bethany had ever acknowledged the disparity between us. It was a small step, but it was something. I left work early and went to the police station to provide my statement. I brought all my documentation, the order of protection, the history of harassment, the security footage from my building showing the attempted break-in. The officer who took my report assured me that my parents would be charged with multiple offences: criminal trespass, attempted breaking and entering, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer. These were serious charges with serious consequences. 2 days later, I received a call from my mother. She was out on bail, and her voice was a mixture of desperation and lingering anger. "Please, Christina," she said, "you have to drop the charges. Do you have any idea what this is doing to us? Your father and I could go to jail. We could have criminal records. Please, if you ever loved us at all, drop the charges." I listened to her plea in silence, feeling nothing but a cold, distant sort of pity. "The charges are not mine to drop," I said finally. "Once you assaulted a police officer and resisted arrest, it became a matter for the state. But even if I could drop them, I would not. You have spent my entire life treating me as less than, and when I finally established boundaries to protect myself, you tried to break into my home. There are consequences for actions, Mom. You are finally learning that." She started to cry, but they were manipulative tears, the kind she had used on me my whole life to make me feel guilty for asserting myself. They did not work anymore. "You are destroying this family," she sobbed. "How can you do this to us?" "You destroyed this family long before I filed that order of protection," I replied. "You did it every time you celebrated Bethany's mediocrity while ignoring my achievements. You did it every time you demanded my help while offering me none. You did it by raising me to believe that I was only valuable when I was useful to you. I am done being useful, Mum. I am done being invisible, and I am done letting you hurt me." I hung up before she could respond. I blocked her number, blocked my father's number, and blocked most of my extended family who had been harassing me. I kept communication open only with the few relatives who had supported me and with Bethany, who had been surprisingly quiet since the day of the arrest. The court proceedings took several weeks. I did not attend, choosing instead to let the legal system run its course without my physical presence. My attorney kept me informed. My parents were ultimately convicted on multiple counts. They received sentences that included significant fines, probation, mandatory community service, and continued restraining orders. My father also had to complete an anger management course. They would not see jail time unless they violated the terms of their probation, but their lives had been fundamentally altered by their choices that day. The reaction from extended family was predictably divided. Some people cut me off entirely, viewing me as the villain who had destroyed her parents' lives over petty grievances. Others reached out with newfound respect, admitting they had always seen the favouritism and inequality, but had not known how to address it. A few family members actually apologised for not standing up for me when I was younger, for not questioning why I was always expected to fend for myself while Bethany was coddled. Bethany surprised me the most. Over the following months, she slowly began to change. She moved out of my parents' home, not into some luxury apartment, but into a modest place she could afford with a regular job she had taken at a marketing firm. She stopped posting constant selfies and started sharing more authentic content about her journey toward independence. She went to therapy and worked on understanding the dynamics that had shaped our family. We started having coffee, occasionally cautious conversations where we both acknowledged the past without trying to rewrite it. My parents, for their part, were forced into therapy as part of their probation. I do not know what happened in those sessions, but I received a letter from them about 6 months after their conviction. It was not a manipulative plea for forgiveness or a guilt trip about family obligations. It was an actual, genuine apology. They acknowledged the differential treatment Bethany and I had received. They admitted they had been wrong to make demands on my property. They took responsibility for their actions at my building and the consequences that followed. They did not ask me to forgive them or resume contact. They simply said they were sorry and that they hoped I found peace and happiness in my life. I read that letter 3 times, searching for hidden manipulation or subtle guilt trips, but I found none. It was just an apology, plain and direct. I did not respond to it. I was not ready to have them back in my life, and I was not sure I ever would be. But I kept the letter. It was proof that change was possible, even if it came too late to salvage our relationship. Time passed. I continued to excel in my career, eventually earning a promotion to Vice President of the North American Division. I used some of my increased income to purchase a small vacation home in Michigan, a quiet place by the lake where I could escape when the city felt overwhelming. I dated casually, nothing serious, taking my time to understand what I wanted from a romantic relationship now that I had finally established healthy boundaries with my family. My penthouse remained my sanctuary. I would stand at those floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and feel a deep sense of satisfaction. I had protected this space. I had protected myself. I had refused to let anyone diminish my achievements or colonize my peace. The view never got old because it represented something far more valuable than luxury or status. It represented freedom. Bethany and I developed a cautious but genuine relationship. We would never be best friends, but we became something like allies who understood each other's damage. She apologized more than once for her role in the family dynamic, for her passivity, for not questioning why things came so easily to her, while I had to fight for everything. I accepted her apologies and appreciated her efforts to build an independent life. She was not the sister I had wished for growing up, but she was becoming someone I could respect. My parents remained at a distance. They completed their probation without incident. I heard through Bethany that they had genuinely changed, that therapy had forced them to confront patterns they had perpetuated for decades. They did not try to contact me again after that letter. I think they finally understood that respecting my boundaries meant accepting that I might never be ready to have them in my life again. Their acceptance of this distance was in its own way the most respectful thing they had ever done for me. On the anniversary of the day my parents were arrested outside my door, I hosted a small dinner party at my penthouse. I invited Bethany, the cousin who had reached out to support me, my attorney, who had helped me navigate the legal system, and Howard from Building Security, who had stood firm that day when he could have easily looked the other way. We ate good food, drank good wine, and talked about the year that had passed. It was not a celebration of my parents' downfall. It was a celebration of the life I had built, despite the boundaries I had learnt to enforce, and the people who had respected those boundaries. As I stood at my windows that night after my guests had left, I felt something I had not felt in my entire childhood or early adulthood. I felt genuinely at peace. The view stretched out before me, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness, each one representing a life being lived, choices being made, boundaries being set or broken. I had spent so many years feeling invisible, diminished, less than. Now I stood in a home I had earned, surrounded by evidence of my success, secure in my right to protect what was mine. The price of this peace had been high. I had lost my parents, at least in any traditional sense. I had lost most of my extended family. I had been forced to take legal action that resulted in their criminal convictions. But the price of not protecting myself would have been higher. It would have cost me my sanity, my security, and my sense of self. It would have meant continuing to live as the invisible daughter, the reliable provider of whatever they needed, the one who achieved without acknowledgement and gave without receiving. I had made my choice, and I would make it again without hesitation. Some people might call it revenge, but I never saw it that way. Revenge is about inflicting pain for its own sake. What I did was simple self-defense. I established boundaries, enforced them when they were violated, and allowed the natural consequences of others' actions to unfold. If that resulted in their pain and public humiliation, those were the consequences of their choices, not mine. Standing in my penthouse that night, I realised that the most satisfying revenge is not making someone else suffer. It is building a life so authentic, so true to yourself, so protected from those who would diminish you that their opinions cease to matter. It is refusing to accept less than you deserve and being willing to stand alone if necessary to maintain that standard. It is choosing your peace over their approval, your truth over their narrative, your freedom over their expectations. I had won not by destroying them, but by refusing to let them destroy me, and that victory was mine to keep forever. What would you have done in my position? Is it possible to be too harsh when protecting yourself from family toxicity? Or is setting firm boundaries always justified? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more real stories about choosing yourself when nobody else will. Your engagement helps these important stories reach others who might need to hear them. Thank you for listening.